Yo, what is up, guys? Snap here. Today we're going to be talking about the most broken item they have ever added to Path of Exile, and that is, of course, going to be Sap of the Seasons. This tincture can be built around primarily because of one line. It is going to be the weapon damage penetrates 1% elemental resistances per mana burn. Now, interestingly, this is uncapped. For some reason, when they added the rarity tincture, they decided it important enough to cap the rarity one, but not the damage one. Kind of shows you where the heads are at GGG. So anyways, talking about this tincture, this is an uncapped elemental penetration buff that you get per mana burn. Now, you can penetrate past 200%. Here is a GGG designer confirming that fact around 2 years ago that you, yes, can indeed still penetrate an enemy even though they're on negative 200 res. There's a few things to talk about here. One of them is primarily going to be, one, how do you build stacks? And two, how do you sustain the tincture? I'm first going to be talking about this in relation to group play builds because this tincture is a lot easier to build around and play around when you're in the group situation. However, there are some places you can use this in solo builds, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So first off, how do you build the stacks? That, of course, is just simply going to be battle within the other tincture. Now, you can have more than one tincture equipped at a time, even if you're not a warden. You just simply can't have more than one active at a time. So what you can do is use this tincture to inflict mana burn on hit with a weapon or a ranged weapon if you are a warden. And this builds stacks incredibly quickly. It can build hundreds and hundreds of stacks per attack if you're using something that has many hits with GMP and chain and stuff like that. Once you've built all of your stacks, you can then simply switch back to Sap of the Seasons to benefit from all of those stacks and get basically an infinite amount of penetration. So that's how you build stacks. But the question is, that's a lot of mana drain. How do you sustain that many burn stacks? The first step is, of course, to convert this to a life drain because life sustain in Path of Exile is a lot easier than mana sustain. So we take the blood-soaked blade keystone to convert it to life. And in a group, the primary way you're going to be sustaining this is going to be using a belt called the Druggery. Now, if you're unaware, life flasks in Path of Exile are very fucking OP. You can get tons and tons of recovery on them, and this flask lets you grant that massive life recovery buff to all of your allies. Here I have built a character which is just a Druggery support, and it has a variety of items that help you with increased life recovery from flasks. You can then multiply all of that increased recovery from flasks with a more recovery if used on low life, and then grant that to all of your allies for a massive life recovery bonus. With this set of gear, with all of the party buffs up, I'm recovering around 60k life per second, and if you hover the flask real quick, it is recovering 162,000 life over 2.73 seconds. And you can sustain this very easily because you have a ton of life flask nodes on the tree that are giving you consistent charges. And so all that's left to do on the carry character is to get a bunch of minus life Kalandra jewelry and then put on a Shav's wrapping to play a low life attack build that can benefit from the near 6,000 penetration that this build can rack up. This is a screenshot in game of this current limit of penetration. At around 3,000 stacks, the tincture hits a hard limit of when your life drain will go from 100% to 0% in a single game tick. Therefore, the flask force turns itself off. If you get a 100% tincture effect, you can double the penetration per stack, and the hard limit of the flask is right around about 6,000% pen. This, of course, is a really crazy multiplier to any attack build. It is increasing your damage by about 60 times or 6,000% more damage, and it is the primary way a lot of 6-man groups are doing Pandemonium unique farming because this build literally just has infinite damage. It is somewhat trivial in group to get builds that are doing more than 100 billion DPS, if not even more, because keep in mind, it is a 60 times multiplier. If your build, for instance, had 2 billion DPS before the tincture here, it is going to be doing 120 billion DPS when you have the tincture active at max ramp. You can see how the numbers get a little bit out of control here. So a few notes about the builds that enable this thing here. The Druggery support that I've cooked up here is not by any means a complete character, just sort of an idea that you can build around. Mainly, you're putting on a Druggery, you're putting on a massive flask that you can benefit the rest of your party with, and then you get a bunch of life recovery on the tree. These nodes here, Profane Chemistry that gives you life recovery from flask, Juice Up the Flask, life recovery here from Field Medicine, this whole wheel here, and then additionally you can get life recovery on flask from the medium cluster jewels as well. Distilled Perfection and Peak Vigor are good candidates here alongside Spike Concoction. You can then tattoo flask duration and or life recovery rate on all of the dex nodes here, giving yourself just a massive recovery rate. The one thing to keep in mind with this build build is that you do not benefit from your own life flask, and so you need to do a few things to fix the recovery on this character alone. And the ways you can do that is to get a bunch of Flagellance flask with the recover 4% of life when you use a flask mastery. This helps with your own personal sustain. Additionally, you can path over here to Eternal Youth, and then combined with a Triumvirate Authority, cast Vault Discipline to give yourself life recharge, which is extremely powerful. Other than that, you're just getting some personal defenses. This character isn't very complicated. Just grab a bunch of life recovery on the tree. The last important thing to note here is you do need to be a Pathfinder, of course, so you get all the extra flask effect. And then, of course, Master Surgeon makes it so the life flask isn't turned off when your teammates reach full life. All of your teammates can then equip a Sorrow of the Divine and then make it so the life flask applies to ES. And then this is giving you something like 60,000 ES per second, which of course is just really fucking broken. You can replace a traditional mine support with this character and also just throw mines with the links that you have here to give yourself an uncapped mine buff, but it's probably the best thing to be throwing. You can also play this in a trio and fit rarity on a color character, which looks something a little bit like this. Shoutouts to Kinney and Reality, who have been playing this in a trio build. They've been doing Nebulous Lightning Strike and then putting on a Shaz for the low life, you know, getting rarity wherever they can, and they've been MFing Pandemonium. You can really put on a bunch of wheelchair garbage on your build when you have a 60 times multiplier at play for your damage. You can really play the Druggery support as a third character in a party alongside our traditional Orobot build and basically just put out the infinite amount of damage. There are other angles, of course. You can lower your life and then go bows. You can go wands with kinetic blast. There are a ton of options if you want to play this in a party. The whole idea of the build is to just get a fuck ton of recovery from the Druggery and somebody abusing flask nodes, giving it to the rest of your party, getting infinite penetration, choose your attack build of choice, and then proceed to just face roll everything in the entire game. I'll also put a link to these builds in the description, but I do want to shout out Lucas here, who has been basically building these characters since we really aren't playing the league anymore, but I've been giving them some advice, just like, you know, how to build these characters, and they have been having some extreme success. I have a clip here of these builds in action, and it is basically able to clear the invigoration stacking Blight bosses with ease. As you can see here, they're pretty much off screening the Blight bosses. If you've tried this strategy, you just know how tanky these bosses are. They have billions and billions of EHP because of the stacking damage reduction, and these builds are just simply able to off screen it. It is just really crazy. And now that you're able to kill the Blight bosses in the invigoration strat, you can pair it with a Titanic Scarab to give them a fuck ton of increased rewards, and you can get pump explosions that look like this. Very, very good strategy. There is, however, another strategy that involves unique farming in T17s with the Pandemonium Scarab, and this content is extremely difficult and requires you to kill insanely tanky bosses. As you can see here, Red Vials just dropped a T0. It is a really crazy strat for generating uniques, so if you can kill the bosses, which this build obviously helps you do, it is going to generate you a lot of uniques if you can do the Pandemonium strat on T17s. We'll link to this video in the description as well if you're curious about this particular unique farming strategy. So those are kind of the ways you can leverage this in a party. I think the minimum you might need to execute this is going to be in a trio, because you need obviously an Orobot, a carry who can wear the tincture and play an attack build, and then your third person is going to be the Druggery support here that is going to give you the recovery necessary to use the tincture to benefit from all that damage. If you're running this in a 6-man or something like that, you can easily just pivot the miner support over to this Druggery support and then throw some weaker mines instead. As for solo players, I have not personally explored all of the options, but I guarantee you there is going to be a setup that is solo viable that involves being a Pathfinder and or a Warden that gets a bunch of life recovery from tattoos and or profane chemistry wheel, for example, to give a life flask that is strong enough for you to sustain the maximum number of stacks. Because at the end of the day, having a 60 times multiplier on your build means that you can take a 5 million DPS build into a 300 million DPS build, and sacrificing a bunch of parts of your build in order to get the jank worked out to have the tincture work is always going to be worth it, just because of the crazy amount of damage it gives you back. I'm the group person. I have definitely worked out a way to make it work in a group. I'm sure there are people that are much better than I can. I recommend some solo builds to use this tincture tech. So if you're wondering how groups are able to kill the Blight bosses in the invigoration strat, or how people are able to kill the monstrously tanky bosses in T17s with the new Titanic Scarab, it is precisely going to be this technology where they get 6,000 penetration via a tincture, and they just play their attack build of choice to just put out an insane amount of damage. I don't know if this will get nerfed mid-league. I do think it's going to be a little difficult to put builds together that can utilize this solo, and I think that's going to be the main thing preventing them from nerfing this, but I could definitely see them putting a cap on this sometime at the beginning of next league. I don't think this tincture will live for very long. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, you want to see them in the comments, I'm always happy to answer any questions you guys might have. Once again, I'm Snap, and thanks for watching.